everyone. This is Hav Ever, and essentially I'm going to be doing a part 2 to a video that I did earlier about Sefer Yoel in Hebrew, and this one's going to be called Sefer Yoel in Hebrew versus Translations. So in this video, I'm going to be expanding on some of the things that were mentioned in the first video because there were some issues that were brought up later by the person in question that was mentioned in the first video, who was a Hebrew Israelite, and I'm going to be answering this one. So one of the explanations is going to be about the actual, how does a Jew who holds by Torath Mosheh actually understand that text? And I'm going to go into further detail about how that's understood. And what I'll be showing in this video is that the Hebrew text is clear that there will be Jews in the land of Israel prior to the events mentioned in Yoel chapter 4, which is verses 1 through 2. And again, one of the things that's important that I found out later is because this person's using a Christian King James version of the Bible, the corresponding verse would be Joel for them, chapter 3, 1 through 2. They have Christians have a different structuring of their translations than what is used in Jewish texts, either in Hebrew or in English. The next thing I'll be showing is that translations often allow people to create incorrect concepts that cannot be easily created if one was reading from the Hebrew text, especially the Torath Mosheh text. So this will all be explained in further detail in this particular video. Now, one of the things I thought was important, because sometimes when you try to explain things to people who have a different concept and come from a different culture and who use different texts, there's sometimes people who don't quite understand that translation can be very tricky, especially in terms of trying to understand it and even the process of translating it. So I thought this quote from Gregory Urahasa is very important, where he says, "A translation could never equal the original. It can approach it, and its quality can only be judged as to accuracy by how close it gets." And I think that's going to be very important in what I'm going to be presenting. The next thing is that I wanted to also get an idea of how Christian translators, those who've actually done the work for Christian translations and built the basis of it, how do they understand their own processing of translations? And that's why I found someone by the name of C.T.E. Renus, I guess hopefully I'm pronouncing his name right, who in an essay that's listed on the left side here for Principles of Translation of the Holy Scriptures, and again, this is from a Christian perspective. This is not a Torath Mosheh perspective or a Jewish perspective. So in regards to how this person sees translation, they mentioned something very interesting. They said that translation ought to be made from the original languages and not merely from another version. And I think the reason why he was stating this, and I think he stated it back in the 1800s, is because there are a number of English translations used by Christians that are just simply redone versions of a previous translation. And he says a translation, however perfect, will never equal the originals in all respects. The different idioms on the one hand and the comparative richness or poverty of all languages on the other will be the cause of many imperfections in a translation. And he kind of goes on and on. I don't want to get into too much detail, but I think there's someone who actually knows the two languages or knows the languages when you're going from one to another would admit that yes, there is no way to say that the original is being conveyed completely by translation because of a number of factors, which include how the language works, and not just simply a word for word, this is the same thing kind of issue, but also like, well, how are these words understood? How did the people who wrote this understand it back in their time? How does the culture this comes from understand it? Because sometimes the words, as they're translated, don't convey the culture or the understanding. As I mentioned in the first particular video, there is no equivalent or way to make equal the King James Version of a Bible, which is a Christian translation, to that of the Hebrew text that is found amongst Torath Mosheh Jews. Essentially, you have to get rid of the translation because the Hebrew text is the text, or you could say the Hebrew text are the text. So even if one says, well, there's a couple of Hebrew versions here, it's easy to take each text and compare them in terms of what words are actually there and how they're to be understood. What this would mean is that even if you found, like, let's say a text that was like 1,000 years old and you found a text that's 1,200 years old, if you take the originals and compare them, you could easily come to a conclusion of what is the correct information and what's not, and what is the most authoritative and authentic version where it's not. With translation, as we'll see pretty soon, there's a number of ways a person could try to take a translation in directions that the writer in the original language had not even intended in any way. So there are several important facts that we need to look at when I'm dealing with this. And again, this is a lot of the setup for what I'm going to be showing you to kind of give you a background. One of the things I've noticed is that Hebrew Israelites normally use King James Version Bibles. So again, like I mentioned before, their book would have Joel 3, chapter 3, 1 through 2, being the location where in a Jewish text it would be Yoel 4, chapter 4, 1 through 2. And that's again talking about this one area that this Hebrew Israelite asked about. And we'll show why this one area he asked about is problematic in terms of his question and the claims that he made. Another thing that's an important fact to note is that in the Hebrew text, the understanding of Yoel chapter 4, 1 through 2, comes from reading chapters 1 through 3. Essentially what this means is that you can't get an understanding of, like say, chapter 4 if you haven't read chapters 1 through 3. That just is not the way any text works, but for the most part, Hebrew definitely does not work that way. And this is especially true because at one point there were no chapter markings or verse markings in the Hebrew text. So the original text of Yoel, back from several thousand years ago, would have had no divisions in it for chapter or for verse. So a person would be forced essentially to read from start to finish what was even in the text, and this is one of the things that brought this conversation up, where this person jumped to one verse in their Bible, that's, chapter 3, 1 through 2, and said, ha, this is the situation based on this. But if say, okay, well, what came before that then? What came after it? So that's an important fact. Another important fact, and again, this is not me trying to make up something about the Hebrew Israelites, I've kind of noticed this in my interactions with them, is that in Hebrew Israelite theology, they are allowed to ignore preceding or following verses to make conclusions about one verse. So now with the preliminaries out of the way, I think we can go back into the text. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into one of the areas that I think is important to deal with in terms of the last bit of the questioning that this particular Hebrew Israelite had, or actually the statement that he was trying to make, I should say, more than a question. And when we get through this, this is where it's going to be important for us to get into the details of the actual Hebrew text itself in order to see where this person has come up with an idea based upon an English text and where their text just simply are not the same as the Hebrew text. And that's where we're going to get to some of the important parts of it. But this brings up the question of, well, how do Torath Mosheh Jews read a text? Because that could be the crux of this issue, where it could be that Hebrew Israelites reading in their English King James versions have a methodology of reading that doesn't exist for those of us who are Torath Mosheh Jews who read from a Hebrew text. And simply we're not talking about the same thing because we're not using the same text and we're not using the same methodologies of reading either text, either the translation or the Hebrew text. So this is where we get into this issue that a Torath Mosheh Jew would start at the very beginning of the book and go from there to the end, especially when a Jew who lived at a time where there were no chapter markings, there were no verse markings, which, again, is a new process. So real quickly, going through the Hebrew part of the text, it basically says, Devar Adonai asher hayom el Yoel ben Patuel shema'u zot hazakonim v'hazinu kol yoshevei ha'oretz v'hayato zot bimechem v'im b'yamei avotechem עליהו לבניכם סיפרו ובניכם לבניהם ובניהם לדור אחר. So the important part that I've noted here, because I went through what this meant in the last video, is what's marked in red there. And essentially what this tells us is that the people that are being talked to by this prophet had received a vision from the creator of all things, and basically was told to speak to the people of Israel, and the people specifically in the land of Yehudah. So it says here, as he was speaking to them, that his audience is the Yoshevei Ha'aretz, which means that these are the residents of Yehudah who are living in the land of Israel. Now, that's marked in the red there. Now, what's marked in the blue is that there's a focus on the future generations of the previously mentioned residents. Uvenechem, levnehem, uvenehem, ledor acher. So essentially, their children, their descendants, and another generation. So continuing with this, the context that is used amongst Torath Mosheh Jews of reading a text from start to finish. Eventually, if we start at the first chapter, of the text. Again, remembering that chapters and verses in ancient Hebrew as well as Hebrew from about 1,000 years ago, there were no chapters and verses. It was just simply the text was there with the the text as it is, as you see it, for example. Going further and further, we can get an idea of exactly how to understand the text from reading it from start to finish. Now, what's important is, and the reason why this is important, is because the particular Hebrew Israelite that inspired this video made a claim that the I guess you could say, original Hebrew Israelites would not show up in the land of Israel until like right before the nations are supposed to judge the Israeli people. Now, one of the things that was clear is when you read the Hebrew text, that's not something that comes out. And that's what I'm showing now, is that if you read through and you get to, for example, in the Hebrew text Yoel, which is now considered to be chapter 3, 1 through 5, you find the information that's being presented here. You find a situation where it's basically being said that there will be, Jews who keep Torath Mosheh found in the land of Israel prior to the events mentioned in Yoel chapter 4, verses 1 through 2. So for the Hebrew Israelite, that would mean his text, Joel chapter 3, 1 through 2, which is the next preceding part that's shown here. So again, this is just a quick overview. I'm going to show in the next slide exactly how this is understood, because again, one of the things I've been championing is that a person who's reading this, reading anything in translation, can come up with all kind of ideas, no matter where in the world they get them from, and no matter how off the wall they may be, from reading one little section of a translation rather than reading the whole text in Hebrew. So let's go into a little bit more detail of why this person is incorrect when they say, and this is the basic point he was trying to make. The point he was trying to make was that the Jews who are living in Israel now are not the real deal, and that essentially there's been people who have taken away the Hebrew Israelite culture and taken it upon themselves, which we'll find out pretty soon that's not the case, especially since he's using a King James version of the Bible, which is not a Jewish text, and no Jews use that text. So let's look at it a little bit more. Okay, so going to the Hebrew text, and again, let's put aside the English text for example for a moment. Okay, so we know that this Hebrew Israelite, using his English King James version of the Bible, is claiming that the Jews who are currently living in the land of Israel right now are not the real deal. He claims that, of course, going by his English translation, that at some point it mentions that everything I mentioned in the previous video is basically talking about a time where right before the nations, as he said, come to judge the people of Israel, that's when they're brought back. The exiles are brought back right then and right there. So again, the Hebrew text says something different than what his English text is telling him. So here's what we find in the Hebrew text. So essentially translating this would be that it will be after this, that this meaning Hashem, the creator of all things, will pour out his ruach al kol basar v'niba'u benechem uvenechem uvenotechem zichanechem chalamot yachalamun bechorotechem v'chayonot yor'u. So translating it is the important part of this is this here. Essentially, this is saying that at some point the creator of all things will pour out his ruach on the people. Now it's talking about future events set in the future tense of verbs, and also it's something that's dealing with the effects of the future generations upon the residents that were mentioned in the first chapter. So everything that was mentioned in the first chapter, these are their descendants that are being described here as something that's going to happen to them, where Hashem pours out his ruach on them, and then they on all basar, as mentioned, so all like flesh, you could say, and they will nibu'u, they will prophesy, so they'll be prophetic. Now, what's interesting and what's necessary is that it goes on to say not only they will have like this ruach poured upon them for nevuah, also their servants and their workers will have it also. So this brings up the question: well, what is this even talking about? What is the ruach? What is the nevuah? So here's the part that we want to get into, where it says ruchi al kol basar nibu'u. Translated, this would be that the Creator is going to pour out his wisdom upon all flesh, meaning Israel and Jews in Israel, and they will have prophetic vision. Now, you may question, okay, well, how exactly did I come to this? Well, first of all, the word ruach in Hebrew is often translated in the Christian English text as being a spirit, where ruach is almost like breath. But again, it's like not a literal word, for example, because, it's like saying, okay, the spirit of the Creator, well, what exactly does that mean? In Hebrew understanding and Jewish understanding, what this basically means is that the Creator will give the knowledge of the Creator to people. And it's something to where he will cause them to have nevuah, meaning that they will have the ability to see clearly the knowledge of Hashem, but that they receive it in the way of visions, or in kind of a half sleep, half awake state, or while they're sleeping in dreams. That's what in Hebrew text nevuah is, and that's not something you can get from the translation. So this description of what I just told you doesn't come in way of most translations, because they would have to add a lot of notes to explain what these words mean to Jews, and what they've always meant to Jews. So when it says al kul basar, it's not talking about, for example, you could literally translate it as on all flesh, but that's not what it's talking about, because Jewish text is explained that the ruach that's being talked about here in nevuah only comes upon Jews in the land of Israel. So Israelis, meaning Jews, only get the ruach of this type in the land of Israel, not outside of it, except for in a couple of extreme situations. So this kind of ruach and nevuah doesn't come outside of the land of Israel. But what's also interesting is, again, as we mentioned, it's talking about the descendants of those people we mentioned earlier, their children and their children's children, and the descendants of Torah-based Jewish leaders. These are the people in this time frame that's being talked about in chapter 3, which is chapter 2 for the Hebrew Israelite King James Version of the Bible, is saying that this is what's going to exist in the land of Israel. And this is before the events mentioned in chapter 4, for example. So before the information mentioned in chapter 4 that I covered in my last video, this is what's going to happen in the land of Israel, that there will be a pouring out of the Ruach of Hashem, the wisdom of Hashem, because that's what this Ruach is understood. Ruach HaKodesh in Jewish text is understood to be like a clear vision or knowledge of the Creator's understandings that are passed down to human beings in a way that we can understand it, which comes either through being half awake or half asleep, or being fully sleeping in a dream state. And this is, again, only like up until this time, for example, until the modern era, is something that had ended a number of centuries ago, actually a couple thousand years ago, where Jews stopped receiving nevuah even in the land of Israel. Going further into chapter 3, we get to a section that you can call like verse 5. Now this brings on the point that there are going to be Jews in the land of Israel before what's mentioned in chapter 4, 1, which 1 through 2, which I mentioned earlier in the previous video. So we get to this section here where what it says is, وَهُيَّ كُلَّ أَشَرْ يِقْرَأ بَشَمْ أَدُونَي يَمَلَّتْ كِي بَحَرْ ציון ובירושלים תהיה פלטו כאשר אומר אדוני ובר שירידים אשר אדוני גורא. So what this means essentially is the section I have marked in red here. وَهُيَّ كُلَّ أَشَرْ يِقْرَأ بَشَمْ أَدُونَي يَمَلَّتْ. So this is essentially talking about Jews who keep Torath Mosheh and escape. So again, this is before those the information we mentioned, that they escape from something. And it's explained in some of the commentaries, Jewish Torath Mosheh commentaries, which I'll show you later, that this escape is escaping from the nations, escaping from the things that happen in the nations. And it basically says Yamalet. So Yamalet is a type of escape, of a type of getting away, for example. The next thing it mentions, and this is in the blue, is Ki Baharet Sion uVyerushalayim Tiye Peleto. So this essentially says is that they flee to Sion in Yerushalayim. So Sion sometimes is used as a term to mean all of Israel, either as a people or as a land, or to a section of Israel that's around where Yerushalayim is. So that's where it says Baharet Sion uVyerushalayim Tiye Peleto. So the place of them to escape to basically be gathered to escape all the troubles that are happening in the world, will be Yerushalayim. So this is again mentioned in a chapter previous to the one that the Hebrew Israelite was making his point about. So going further, if we look at kind of the greenish area, what it says here, Ka'asher amar Adonai uva shiridim asher Adonai yikore. So essentially what this translates is it says, when Hashem says to the remnant escapees, which Hashem calls. And this is something that, again, proves the point I was making, that there will be Jews here in the land of Israel who keep Torath Mosheh prior to the events mentioned in chapter 4, because this is in chapter 3. And again, the King James Version Bible, it would be like chapter 3, so this section would be from chapter 2 of the King James Version. And see, this is where the confusion comes in about translation, because now the English translations for Christian texts have chapters in different places, where if you were to try to equate it to the Hebrew text, you're looking in two different places here. So essentially what this tells us is that there will be Jews in the land of Israel prior to the events mentioned that the Hebrew Israelite brought up earlier, that I covered in my previous video. And before that point, there will be Jews in the land of Israel because they'll be escaping the things that are happening outside of the land of Israel. And that's when it mentions later on, which I covered in the last video, that there will be exiles who will be brought in, but those exiles are a different group than the group who gets there first, for example. So going through the commentaries, we see that, for example, a couple of examples of Radak, who's Rabbi David ben Yosef Gamchi, and he basically, echoes this idea that when it says Ashpochu ruchi ala kol basar, he says Pirush bi Yisrael. So it's talking about the land of Israel. This is going to happen. Kamo she'amru b'makom acher kol basar ve'eno lachol ba'alei chaim ela ha'adam levado v'omer v'vorech kol basar. And then this is mentioned in the green. Yavo kol basar ken parat hine kol basar ali Yisrael haruim liyot uruach hakodesh alehem. So essentially he's saying here that this is the people of Israel who will receive the Ruach Kodesh upon them because of the fact that they are proven to be like the people of keeping the Torah, and there have been Torath Mosheh Jews here in the land of Israel, and this particular Hebrew Israelite mentioned at one point that the entrance of Jews after like the 47, the modern state of Israel, is something that proves that, the Jews here right now are not the real thing, but we see here that this is something that was only held amongst those who hold by King James Version of the Bible or Hebrew Israelites. Now the bottom part here that you see is a continuation of what Radak mentions. And one of the things he mentions, which is marked in green, is yipalu rabim Yisrael v'hakadoshim v'yira'e ha'el be'emet yimlatu. So essentially it says that there will be a lot of Jews who will fall before, and essentially the Kodesh people, but that they will, escape, essentially to the truth of Hashem. Amru Yeshua, he's mentioning Yeshua, mentioning the Navi Isaiah, V'haya nish'ar b'Tzion, v'noter b'Yerushalayim Kodosh Yomar lo, kol ha'katuv lachem b'Yerushalayim. So again, even the prophet Yeshayahu mentions that there will be a group that will be in Sion, in the land of Israel, and will be keeping Torath Mosheh correctly. And then later he ends with Kol asher yikora b'Shem Adonai, v'hu yeshikadohu be'emet. כמו שאמר, קרוב השם לכל קרוב, לכל אשר יקראוהו באמת והם שיורדים, אשר השם קורא כי הם יקראוהו באמת והוא יקרא אותם עבדי אוהבי. So essentially the people who keep Torath Mosheh will be in the land of Israel. This is something that Jewish Torath Mosheh commentaries even say concerning chapter 3 of the Hebrew text. So again, this is something that shows that there's a difference between how Hebrew Israelites view their English translation of wherever they got the. Now, this is again further even emphasized by the Malbim, and I won't go into further too much detail about this because it basically says the same thing, that the Creator of all things will basically help those Jews who are keeping Torath Mosheh, and these are the people called by the name of Hashem, and that they will escape, and they'll be escaping to the land of Israel. And of course, this is like where he says that when it says Ki v'haret Zion u'v'Yerushalayim tiye pelita, he adds the word, which is marked in yellow and bold and underlined, Sham. So his version would be Ki v'haret Zion u'v'Yerushalayim Sham tiye pelita. So essentially, he's stressing that the place of the escape that will happen in this verse, this chapter in this verse, is of Torath Mosheh Jews to the land of Israel prior to the events mentioned by this Hebrew Israelite, where the nations are gathered together in the valley of Yehoshaphat. Before this even happens, which is mentioned in chapter 3, there's a group of Jews who make it to the land of Israel before that point. And that's further, something that's expressed even in the red that's below, where it says, "V'gam b'shar mekomot shesham lo nisalu kulam tiye pleta b'shivredim asher Hashem yikoreh shehem hatzadikim kol hakoreh et Hashem u'mitpalel alav." So essentially, he further backs up this idea that there will be those who will escape and will basically be in the land of Israel prior to the events mentioned by the Hebrew Israelite commenter, the person who was commenting. I guess this is also brought up by several commentators. So again, I won't go into this one as much either. I added it. Initially, I wanted to go more into it, but I don't want to make this video just too. So one of the things that's interesting, if you go to the Jewish Virtual Library, they have an interesting article about the exile, the Babylonian exile, that states the following. The Chaldeans followed standard Mesopotamian practice, deported the Jews after they had conquered Jerusalem in 597 BCE. And underlined, the deportations were large, but certainly didn't involve the entire nation. Somewhere around 10,000 people were forced to relocate to the city of Babylon, the capital of the Chaldean Empire. In 586 BCE, Yehuda itself ceased to be an independent kingdom, and the earlier deportees found themselves without a homeland, without a state, and without a nation. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Chaldeans, only deported the most prominent citizens of Yehuda, professionals, priests, craftsmen, and the wealthy. The Jews who were considered people of the land, Am Haaretz, were allowed to stay. So Jewish history then has two poles during the exile, the Jew in Babylon and the Jews who remained in Yehuda. Yehuda seems to have been racked by famine, according to the Book of Lamentations, which was written in Jerusalem during the exile. The entire situation seemed to be one of infinite despair. When Nebuchadnezzar deported the wealthy citizens, he redistributed the land among the poor, so some residents of Yehuda were better off. So again, this brings up that point that we mentioned earlier. that in order to understand, now that we're getting into Yoel 4:1, or in the King James Version, Yoel 3:1, in order to even understand that, you'd had to have read everything beforehand, and you'd have to know how the language works, as well as the history that's even being talked about here. So in the previous video, I showed the following, where I said that, for example, when it says, Ki hene b'yamim ha'hem uva et hahi, because here, thus is in the days and in that time, or in that season, and then what was mentioned later is essentially Asher Ashiv at the Shavut Yehuda Yerushalayim, which I will return the exiles of Judah and Yerushalayim. This is a different group that's mentioned in the previous chapter. The previous one mentioned a group that was brought back because they were called by Hashem, and they escaped to the land of Israel. Then this part mentions that this is something where Hashem brings back a different group, which are called the Shavut. So Shavut is a different type of exile. So we saw in the previous verses, the group that came back earlier were being called the Shoridim. They were also being told that they were Yamalet, or the Pleta. So this is a different group of escapees altogether. This exile is brought, this group right here, for example, in chapter 4, is brought back by Hashem himself. The previous group are allowed to escape, or caused to escape, because Hashem saw that they were keeping Torath Mosheh correctly. So as we see, there have always been Jews in the land of Israel, and there's never been a situation where there hasn't really been some form of Jewish presence in one form or the other here in the land of Israel. There's always been Jews here. There have been episodes or periods where certain enemy armies came in and pushed Jews out, and then Jews sometimes, in fact, came back in or hid out. So that's an important point. Okay, so the next thing I want to bring up is, in the previous video, I had showed how this section here, which says Nishpatati Imam, meaning that this is the section of Yoel 4, chapter 4, verse 2, that talks about the nations being brought to this valley called the Emek Yehoshaphat. Now, what's important here, as I mentioned earlier, is that the Hebrew Israelite who was bringing up this point, who inspired this whole video, had mentioned that the nations will be judging the people of Israel during this period, which is mentioned in Yoel 4:2. But as we see here in this text, as I explained earlier, it says that the Creator will will enter into judgment with them, meaning not with them in terms of like sitting next to them and judging somebody, but against them in a sense, or on them, imam. So it's like the context here in the Hebrew is clear, where in English, depending on how you decide to translate this, you could easily have someone who misinterprets the words you choose as being something different. So again, this disproves what the Hebrew Israelite was saying earlier, that the nations will judge the people of Israel during this in this verse, in this chapter. And what it's really saying is the Creator will judge against them for what they had done to exile the people of Israel from the land of Israel. And now let's get into some points about translation. Now, one of the things that's important is that the Hebrew text uses a system called ta'amim. Now, this slide here explains what the ta'amim are. And essentially, the ta'amim have three distinct functions: musical, syntactical, and grammatical. Primarily, they indicate the musical motifs in which the biblical text is chanted. Each accent represents a group of notes, tropes, that the reader fits to each word. The accents identify the stressed syllable in each word by being placed above or below the syllable that receives the stress. Knowing which syllable receives the stress helps provide meaning to the text, because often the only distinction between two words that sound the same but have different meanings, homophones, is the syllable that receives the stress. The musical motif of the accents produces a chant that adds an aesthetic dimension to the public reading, as recommended in the Talmud. All the ta'amim are classified into two groups: disjunctive ta'amim, called malachim, kings, and conjunctive ta'amim, called mishartim, servants. They are arranged in patterns that help make the meaning of the text clear and intelligible by pointing to the interrelationship of words. And to the right, you see these ta'amim that, a number of them that show up in the Jewish text, meaning that these are necessary in order to know the meaning of the text, as well as where pauses are or stresses are. And by changing any one of these or taking them away, you can easily change the meaning of the text. And the thing is, in translation, you would never even notice it. A person who's reading a translation would never notice if someone took away these stresses, because they think that they're reading the text as it's supposed to be presented. They think they're reading it based upon the meanings that the translator chose. But there's some situation where the translation could be completely inaccurate, even if the words are accurate, simply based on the stresses, the pauses that they use to insert. And I'll show you how this can work in just. So one of the things that happened was I was sent by a person who's not associated with this, the Hebrew Israelite that inspired the video. They asked me a question, well, what's the difference between the Hebrew text and these particular versions that they sent me? They sent me one English version called the Voice. They sent me another one that was the New King James Version. And they sent me another one called the OJB. So this is how they sent it. Now, you'll notice that the text is divided up in a certain way. Like the first one, the voiced one, is divided in a way to where there are certain lines that are separated from each other. So the first question you have to ask is, why is that exactly? Why is it in this one here there's a break between the first sentence and the next one, where the next one goes to a different line? Is that something that's derived from the Hebrew text itself? And the answer to that is no. And you have to ask the question, does this have a meaning to the translator? Did he mean something by putting this text in this way, where the periods are where they are? And then like the other versions, same thing. Okay, these versions are a little bit different than the one above it. What's the difference? Noted where just looking at it from a language and grammar standpoint, without the getting into the meanings of Hebrew words, this is where some of the differences are. So everything you see in red or blue is places where I marked that by reading the Hebrew text, these translations are missing something because of the fact that the person translating it didn't go by the Hebrew text. So in some places people may say, well, okay, well, fine, you're adding commas and adding punctuation in places. What does that change? Well, the first one, the one that's here, you'll notice that in the first line it says, I will assemble all of Israel's enemies. But the actual Hebrew text doesn't use the word for enemies, which is oyavim. It uses the term goyim, which just means nations. It doesn't mean enemy nations, it just means nations. And then after that, there's punctuation differences that for a Jew reading a Torath Mosheh Hebrew text changes the meaning. You change the ta'amim, you change the meaning. You put, and the best way to make it equivalent in English is sometimes a comma or semicolon or period. In some cases, there is no equivalent. And you just simply have to know the Hebrew text has something that doesn't exist in English. And that's the reality. So where a person may say, okay, well, this doesn't mean anything to me. Yes, reading it in English, it may mean nothing to you. Reading in Hebrew, it would mean everything if someone changed any one of these things that I added to explain the text more clearly. And that goes for even the second part they have. The second one they had fewer of them, but the thing is that there were certain areas there where they were also adding things like, for example, they capitalized like certain words. Like in the last one, they capitalized the word goyim, where in the Hebrew text there's no such thing as capitalization. There's no reason to capitalize that letter. So this is something that's important and changes the meaning. These are the points I wanted to make. The Hebrew text is clear that there are two waves of Jewish presence in the land of Israel. We showed earlier that there's one wave of people who keep Torath Mosheh, which would also include some people who didn't keep Torath Mosheh, and they make it to the land of Israel, and that's where they're the first group that shows up. We know that the Hebrew text says that there's another wave, and that the English translations can be easily used to create narratives that are not present in the Hebrew text. A quick example of that is that there's a person who was involved in this discussion who eventually said, well, okay, well, according to both texts, it says that the nations will come to the Emek Yehoshaphat, or the valley of Yehoshaphat. How can all the nations in the world be in that valley? But the Hebrew text does not say all the nations. It's just simply talking about, like, if you will, representatives of the nations will be there, or this is where the nations will come, and that's where they'll be judged. But it doesn't say like all the people in the world. But again, reading an English translation, you could easily come to these conclusions that are not based upon the text itself, and you can easily create things if someone just simply pulls out, like their English text and says, okay, Joel 3:1, it says this. This is talking about the Hebrew Israelites. This is talking about you. If you look at the Hebrew text, it doesn't say anything like that here. If someone says the real Jews are not in the land of Israel yet, or the real Israelites are not there yet, see, this part of Yoel says this. Well, the Hebrew text doesn't support that. All you have to do is read it carefully in context in the previous verses, and you see that's not the case. And then finally, a person reading a translation doesn't see the same concepts, aspects, and insights that a person reading the original Hebrew does. And again, for a person reading this reading something in English, they look and say, well, I don't see the difference. But a person reading Hebrew says, yes, there's lots of differences here. There's poetic differences. There's grammar differences. Why did the author write it this way rather than that way? This word is used for this group of escapees, where this word is used for a different group of escapees. This word is used to talk about a refugee. This word is used to talk about a different type of refugee. So these are the things that come out that a Hebrew text and a person reading it would see. And just to make it clear, this is not a matter of as some person put it, that the Hebrew text is more important. It's that the Hebrew text is the authority. It is the authority. It was written in Hebrew. The Hebrew text is the authority. The translation is not the authority. And people can come up with the wrong conclusions based on the translation. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Thank you for your time, and take care and stay safe.